you got engaged. Congrats.
Yeah, finally.
Only 5 kids later, but not even 5.
Well, like, because we're blended, right? So he has 3 kids and I have one. Only his 2 younger ones are the only ones that live with us. So it's like we have the 3 girls, and then but we don't actually have any kids together. So none of them are actually ours together, and we've been together for almost 3 years. So,
But it's like he's been through the birthing process with you.
for sure, twice. This will be the third birth that we've gone through, so it's kind of like funny.
It is really interesting to think how like you don't actually have any that are together, but you have you've been through the experience. So essentially you do have some together, kind of.
Yeah, and we've gone through that whole like process. We just have never done like the newborn thing together, which you know what, I'm totally okay not doing actually.
You know, and it's funny, last time we spoke you said something that resonated so much because it's like when you get home from the hospital after you go into labor and you don't have to deal with a newborn, it's like, oh, because you know that
Actually,
little period, that week or 2 weeks after you break your body in half, it's the worst. Like it's, and I don't ever want to tell women that, like, prepare to be smashed in pieces, but it's like to go home and not have a baby, I'm sure is like,
healing was way better, right? Like I had a C-section last time, and like it was not like it was. The recovery was still tough because it's still like surgery, but
yeah.
like I could lay in bed for like 8 hours and no one was bugging me, and like they brought me food, and like it was I just walked around in a diaper all day. Like it was awesome.
The beauty of surrogacy.
Yeah, really.
Okay, so since this is kind of like our first time, even though okay, so we'll take it kind of as our first time. Um, so basic stuff. You're on your fifth surrogate. No, fifth baby,
Fourth.
fourth surrogate.
Fourth surrogate journey. So my one was a miscarriage. Someone got all like prissy on my Instagram saying I was deceiving people because I said I was on my fourth journey, and they're like, well, you haven't had 4 babies. You've only had 2, and now you're pregnant with a third. I was like, well, yeah, but I still was like 4 months pregnant. Like if someone like lost a baby at 36 weeks, would you be like, oh, doesn't count, right? Like
People are so
I
weird.
this will be the third birth.
Okay, and that that does that include your daughter or no?
No, that's just surrogacy. So this is my 5th pregnancy. It'll be my 4th delivery.
Got it.
Yeah.
So I feel like there are so many things that I want to talk about because I have a very good idea of everything. Is there anything that you really want to touch on that we should just nail right off the bat?
Honestly, not anything specific that I can think about. Like I'll just take your lead. Like just feel free to ask questions and I'll answer. And I'm pretty good at like jumping in if there's like, oh, I'll talk about this. I'll kind of weasel that in. Yeah.
So the one thing I definitely want to talk about this time that we didn't really touch on last time is social media, because you know you are raising a lot of awareness. You're advocating for this surrogates in general, and even more than that, you are. So what? How many months are you along now? You're due in what, March? Is it?
April.
April.
So
Okay.
I'm 27 weeks on Sunday.
Okay. So
So like almost 7 months ish.
Yeah, I'm horrible. When I was pregnant, and even now, I'm always like 8.5 months, or I'm horrible at the weeks thing. Maybe on the next go around, I'll be better with the weeks.
Yeah.
So you basically, your life revolves around this. Like you do it because you're in Canada, and it is, which is mind blowing. You don't get paid to do this, which you told me last time, which I was just like, holy. Because I'm sure people always say, oh, well, you got to do it for the money, where you don't.
Yeah, and I can explain about that too, because a lot of people are like, "Oh, you must be so great doing it for free." And I was like, "Okay, let's clarify. It's not like for free. Like a lot of my expenses are covered. Like I can submit receipts. I'm reimbursed. Like first time surrogates are typically reimbursed up to $2,000 a month for 10 months, so it's $20,000 for the pregnancy. But those are things like kilometers, childcare, lost wages, extra groceries, special diet, supplements, maternity clothes, all that kind of stuff, right? So it's pregnancy expenses. And so it's like, that's all coming back to me, but I'm certainly not like putting in a pool. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And you are advocating to make it a little bit easier, because
Yeah.
obviously I don't know anything about it in the US, so I need to find someone here who can, because I'm sure as I grow and as you and your following grows, it's different everywhere you go, whether it's state by state or country by country. But I am very curious because I'm sure you know some of the laws in the US,
Yeah.
but it just blows my mind because it's insane.
Hmm. Yep.
So I had a point to that. I'm like bleh, this morning. You you have to keep track of all your expenses.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
you're
there's a
advocating to make it a little bit easier so it's not just here's my receipt, here's this receipt, and because I'm sure at this point is it pretty tedious or
and I can like talk about this too. So
yeah,
like right now, paid surrogacy is criminalized. So the goal is to decriminalize paid surrogacy so that a surrogate can be reasonably compensated, similar to basically our reimbursement cap, maybe a little bit more, because what the reimbursements doesn't account for is like the time it takes away from your family and the year or year and a half or 2 years out of your life that you dedicate to this, the travel restrictions, like the what you put your body through, the hormones, like all that kind of stuff. And so yes, reimbursing like actual expenses is one thing, but I think one thing that completely takes away is kind of the like everything else it does too, right? And the effects on your life is kind of
so it seems like, and I think that it's the same in the US, the government is run by all these old white men and they have no idea what's going on. So they just
yeah.
assume that, you're having sex and then you are having someone's baby and then you give it to them. And clearly that's not how it works.
We have legislation that like explains surrogacy. So like I have a full contract and everything that outlines that it's not my egg. It wasn't obviously created in a natural conception. It was done via IVF, all that kind of stuff. So surrogacy is legal in Canada. A lot of people get that paid surrogacy is criminalized. They think it's illegal. No. Surrogacy is legal. You just can't be paid. But
Right.
you're right. The problem is that like so let's say I buy, like I need gravel because I'm really nauseous. Well, is some person gonna look at that expense and be like, but did she really need it? Like maybe it's not a pregnancy expense. Did she use every single pill? Because then that's not a full. She didn't use all of it. Did her partner maybe use 2 of those gravel pills? They weren't all for her. Like it's very very tedious, and not that the problem again with that is like all these rules are in place, but there's no one actually mandating it. There's not anybody checking. There's not any like. There's no kind of guiding body for it at
There's
all.
like
So it's
no regulation to actually enforce it, essentially.
no, like with the exception of like the lawyers that put the contract together being like, here's what you can and cannot be reimbursed for, right? It's really at the like honor system and discretion of the intended parents. Like my intended mom, she's like, okay, like I don't care if you need gravel, like obviously go get gravel, stuff like that. But it really just like depends on everybody's situation. So it's kind of like it's just sticky, right? It would be so much easier if they could just be like, okay, instead of reimbursing you up to 25,000 or whatever, we'll just pay you 30 and it comes in 3 installments
Yeah.
through the pregnancy. You don't have to worry about receipts, you don't have to track kilometers, you just use that for what you need it. And it's basically very similar to what's happening now. It's just not having to submit every receipt, track every single kilometer, like all that kind of stuff.
Even if they just gave you like a credit card and said, okay, this is your like, then they can
Mm,
check it if they want.
sticky because then it's not in your name, and then it's like then it could like there's
Uh,
all really careful with like if it borders into like financial coercion. That's like one of the reasons that like there's a lot of uh and we can talk about this too once
yeah.
we get going. Like, there's a lot of guidelines to be a surrogate and like restrictions, and one of them is that you have to be financially stable.
Right.
And the reason for that is because now not so much in Canada, because we get things like baby bonus and things like that everybody gets kind of.
What is a baby bonus?
um
Like from work, you're saying?
no, where are you from? Are you in the
I'm in
States?
New York.
Okay, so we have like it's called like basically if you make up to like $80,000, the government gives you every money for like every month for having kids. and you get it per kid, and it's anywhere from like a couple hundred to like $600 or $700 a month, and it's
Really?
based income. Yeah. And like there's other programs and stuff like that, but it's not necessary. It's not like welfare. It's not like, it's just kind of government programs that everybody's pretty much eligible for, right? That's a little bit different than in the States. So like where you have like food stamps
We don't get
or
anything unless you're poor, basically.
yeah, yeah. So with that, so that's the reason the financially stable part comes in. So if you have a surrogate in the States, for example, or even in Canada that's on like strict government assistance, like income, unemployment, all that kind of stuff. If they're a surrogate and then also receiving all that, it can get kind of sticky because it can be considered financial coercion on the part of the intended parents, and it can actually affect them getting parentage of their baby.
Wow.
So States, it's really important. So you can't be on state like funding. You can't be
Welfare,
on
nothing.
food stamps, welfare, anything like that. Because if if the intended parents ever like got to the end of it and they're like, oh, we paid her, $30,000 to have this baby, and then anyone like kind of investigated or stepped in, they could be like, oh, well, that's considered like financial coercion. Not to mention, if they were getting paid and then also receiving government funding, they can lose their funding. They can have to pay. So it's really, really important that like surrogates are like financially stable. And that's why, because like it can affect the parents actually getting parentage of their baby. So it's very like complicated. I don't think people realize that surrogacy is as complicated as it is,
Yeah.
and so much goes into it. It's like it's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so, I mean, I guess it makes sense kind of, but yeah, that's crazy because so basically, I mean, I guess where I was going with that or what I was thinking was if I do you have pregnancy brain?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So I'm
Fridge, open the cupboard, like it's all over the place.
I'm like postpartum, like what, 8 months now, and I still have it. And my husband always makes fun of me and he's like, and he'll like say it to our daughter who obviously doesn't even understand. He's like, "Oh, mom's all scatterbrained again." And I'm like, "Baby, you don't understand. Like I can't, like, I don't get it.
It doesn't work the same way. Like your
It's a
brain just
real
doesn't.
thing." I wonder how long it lasts for.
I don't know. I have a 5-year-old and it's still happening. So I'm
Um, okay, so basically, what would you suggest, or what do you think is some sort of direction, or how are you advocating to make it so the government is, going in the right direction when it comes to this? Because it is a real thing, and there is such a misconception and all these weird pre-notions on what exactly surrogacy is and how it's, disgusting or whatever. I've seen some crazy comments that I know we've talked about it before. And obviously going on social media, you put yourself out there, but you're putting yourself out there for the greater cause. You're not doing it to be ripped down. You're just educating people.
Yeah, I would say I've been pretty lucky that I haven't had too many like negative things on Instagram. The only time that I'll see like a lot of negative stuff is that like if a big page or an article's been written about me or something like that, and then that gets published. Sometimes the comments under that, but I think a lot of it. I mean, even when people kind of say those comments, I think I'm really good at kind of approaching that in more of an educational way. I simply think that a lot of people just are really uneducated about surrogacy, and they don't understand what it means or how it works, and so it creates all these kind of like feelings and emotions in them that like they, like just aren't realistic, right? So I think a lot of it comes from a place of uneducation. So I think my biggest goal with my Instagram page is just to kind of show like, because like when I started it, like I used to have a Facebook group like years ago, and I would share photos and stuff. So that way, like people could, my family and friends, there was like 200 people in there that could like follow along, right? But then it was hard to kind of like find things, and it kept switching. Like it was difficult to navigate. So I switched to Instagram last year, and it just kind of really, really took off. And then I started doing interviews, and I started doing kind of some more like social media. I had a couple posts that went kind of viral. So it really got out there. And then now like a lot of people follow it. And I'm like, well, you know what? If I have this platform, I'm going to try to use it the best I can. Of course, I'm reflecting my personality and like my kind of journey through this and like all that kind of stuff. But I do try to, use it as well to show like, this is why you need lawyers. This is why this is important. And this is how this works. And I've explained about the receipts. I've talked about how IVF transfers work and contracts and why you need one and all that kind of stuff. Cause I think it's important for people to kind of be able to be like, oh, like, this is how it works. And I think it's twofold. So not only is it helpful for, well, maybe threefold. Not only is it helpful for the general public to kind of learn more about surrogacy, because like the only thing that people know about surrogacy is like that Kim Kardashian had a surrogate. Or like, you know what I mean? And so it's like this stigma that like only rich people have surrogates, which is not the case. Like there's perfectly normal people that have surrogates and have babies through surrogacy. And you would never know in your mom group which baby was born via surrogacy, and chances are there's probably at least one. So it's helpful for kind of the general public to learn. I think it's helpful for people researching who want to be surrogates, because I think a lot of people are like, oh, I'm going to be a surrogate, and they don't realize that like there's a lot that goes into it. Like there's a lot, and to kind of be prepared in that way. And then I think it's also helpful for like intended parents or future intended parents that maybe are on their own infertility journey and may have to look into surrogacy. And I think seeing an account like mine or like others that kind of share openly like that is really helpful for intended parents to be like, okay, like this is from her perspective, this is how surrogacy works. Like she's normal, like she's just, because a lot of people are like, they have an idea of the type of people that become surrogates. And I'm not really sure where that kind of comes from. I know that there's movies like Baby Mama where, she becomes a surrogate because she needs the money and she's kind of, and she's like scamming them. And I think genuinely a lot of people think that that's what surrogacy is. And then, of course, you get like those unregulated stories that show up in the media or the Lifetime movies about surrogates that keep the baby or, like try to sue the parents. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I cannot stand these stories because they all happen because they didn't do things legally. They didn't have a contract. They did like at-home insemination without a contract, didn't use a fertility clinic. Like they were not in a legal state, like all this type of stuff, right? Like regulated legal surrogacy is perfectly legal. And there's no way a surrogate would ever be able to take your baby. So when you hear those stories, I think people get really like riled up about it because they're like, oh, it's so dangerous to have a surrogate. Like they might try to steal your baby. And I'm like, I don't want your baby. Like no offense, but like I really don't want your baby.
I feel like that's your famous line.
It is.
Well, and I think that the other part of that is like, they just, and then we obviously discussed this, and I'm gonna stop saying that because we've discussed a lot of this, that you have your degree and you're finishing up your degree in a field that, and you've taken classes on it, so it makes you understand that your body's a vessel and you're literally carrying someone else's baby and you're just gonna basically deliver it to them. And I think that it's understanding that mentality that people don't understand, because once you have a baby that's yours, you think, well, I couldn't imagine giving it up. And of course, because it's yours. But when it's not yours and you go into it with that mentality.
Yeah, it's completely different. Like people say, how can you feel a baby move? And I was like, well, when I feel a baby move, I'm like, oh, cool. Like, and then I text the mom and like, he's moving, like, so cool. Right. It's not about me. It's not like, and like, I have no desire to take this baby home. Like if I was pregnant with my own baby right now, that would be very different. Right. I'd be planning a nursery. I'd be planning, the birth and like how our family would be changing, bringing another baby. But that's like nothing that's happening right now. It's just, I'm just carrying it. And I've carried for them before, right? Like I love this family. Their other son is 3.5 and like, he's going to be a big brother. And like, it's just an exciting time for them. So it's like being able to kind of like see friends of yours, like have their children. And like, 4 years ago when I met them and they, were trying to have kids and didn't have any, and now they have 2, or 1 and 1 on the way. Right. So it's like, I don't know. It's like fulfilling to be like, yeah, like I was a part of that. And like, I always tell like, cause like, I think a lot of people get all like stressed out about surrogates thinking they're like superheroes. And I like personally have a big problem with like the surrogacy pictures where she's like, or it's like the little kid being like, my mom grows families. What's your superpower? And I'm like, first of all, I feel like that's very insensitive to people that can't have children. Like biologically,
Definitely.
being able to grow a baby is not a superpower, but it's something that I'm able to do, and it's something that she wasn't able to do. So together, we're able to kind of figure it out and do it right, and let her have her baby, right? Kind of no matter where it grows, it's still going back to her, you know?
Yeah, it is. It's nice that you look at it that way because I think that a lot of times people do tend to be insensitive on one side or the other. They don't see both sides. But because you've been on both sides and you know
Yeah,
both sides and you're um I guess what you plan to do eventually for your career, it's helpful to know understand and know and you've experienced it firsthand. So it
yeah.
only makes sense that you can relate and not, so it's good. I mean, I think it's just beyond, it's incredible that you're putting it out there and you are really showing and telling and explaining real life and the reality of what this is. Um, do you know anyone else who, like, do you have like surrogate friends? Does that like, or is that weird or?
You know, like so I'm not with an agency, but with a lot of the agencies that I know, the Canadian agencies, they usually have like their little like community and stuff like that, and they'll do get-togethers, and I think that's really nice because it kind of gives people like other surrogates that are kind of going through the same thing, and that's kind of cool. I do know other surrogates, and I've met a ton through Instagram and things like that. So yeah, like it is like this little community, right? And people kind of, we all kind of are going through the same thing together. And so I think that's kind of interesting. And I think it's really nice to have like a support system like that if you need it. And especially for first time surrogates, that's why I think like going with an agency for a first time surrogate is really helpful, because not only are they going to kind of guide you through the whole thing, but they're also going to provide that like support system that you might need, you know?
Well, and I think that most women that go into it, they're probably not looking to have a career in it, or maybe they are. I don't know, but you know much more in depth because
Yes. Yeah. Like, and I started out very like great. I feel like we need to start like recording this so
I
that
am,
when
I
I
am, I've been.
so I feel like I'm like, are we even going?
Yeah, I am.
Okay, what's the question? I totally forgot.
Oh my, me and my damn scatterbrain.
You know, I'm the
Um,
same way, right? This is the
that if
problem.
you
Part of the pregnancy, I don't know what, you know,
to be like with your career, very in depth how it works with having to. So you didn't have an agency.
So I did at the very beginning. So when I first signed up with
Okay.
surrogacy, I was with an agency, and that's how I found my first two sets of intended parent, or three sets of intended parents. And then this one we're not with an agency because it's a sibling journey. We didn't really, we use the same lawyers. We kind of are doing everything the same, so we didn't have to have that middleman. But agencies are really helpful because they're going to kind of walk surrogates through the process, and intended parents, right? So, and if you're a first timer and you don't really know a lot, it's kind of helpful to have that. So for me, like I've obviously, like when I first started, I knew nothing about surrogacy. Like I signed up very quickly, and I did not do as much research as I would advise other people to do,
Mhm.
simply because I didn't know I had to, right? So I think that's why, like, I tell people now, like, do research, like, follow people, and I say, like, don't necessarily even look at surrogacy, but follow people that are documenting their infertility journeys and get the intended parents' perspective. Because I think when you go into surrogacy, really understanding why somebody needs you to help complete their family, I think your empathy goes up a lot, and it becomes more of like a collaborative thing, not like I'm a surrogate and I'm so great. It's like this person needs someone like me or they wouldn't be able to have their baby, and so I'm really happy I can help in a small way to be that for them, you know? And I think it's like when you see, like, I follow a lot of women and families and stuff like that on Instagram that are going through their own infertility journey, and they may or may not need to go through surrogacy and stuff. So I think it's like it's kind of good to, I don't know, get their perspective and see everything they've been through. And as well, like, especially with my work, like, because I'm going to go into, like, I graduate in April, and I'll be a registered social worker, but yeah, it's been a long a long time. And I have my first degree was in like childhood development type studies, but then also grief and death and dying and trauma and loss. So I kind of have that kind of grief and bereavement and trauma background as well. So I really want to kind of help counsel and help guide intended parents and surrogates through infertility, through loss, through grief, all that kind of stuff. And then with my knowledge, with everything that I've kind of gone through and everything that I've really learned, I think it's kind of I want to be like a good resource for people, you know what I mean, to be able to be like, this is what it's like and this is how it works, and know that I'm someone who's really knowledgeable about it. And I've done a lot of my papers in class, and like a lot of my like final projects and things like that on infertility type stuff. Like something I'm working on right now with my like placement that I'm doing is a big resource binder and basically a step-by-step guide for counseling people with postpartum depression and postpartum anxiety.
Wow.
Which is like, so I'm kind of creating this entire resource binder for people to go into counseling and what they need to know and the types of therapy and the theories you would use and how you would use them and all that kind of stuff. So that's something I'm working on now. I've done papers on egg donations and egg donor conceived children and outcomes and things like that. And it's like, there's not a lot of studies either, right? So like,
Yeah.
there's like, when I'm looking for information, I'm like digging to try to find information on assisted reproduction. And I'm like, considering the amount of people that are using it, it just seems crazy to me that there's not more information. So twofold, like I want to be able to advance my education. I want to go on to get my master's, which is kind of my next step. And then I'll be able to register as a psychotherapist.
Nice.
And then that's kind of where I want to have my own private practice. I want to do specialized fertility counseling, kind of things like that. I want to work with donors, surrogates, intended parents. Like it's like, I don't know exactly the direction it'll go, but I know like generally where it'll be.
Well, and it's cool because you're taking classes, you're in school, you're working on your degree, but you're doing all the things that basically will help you and assist you once you finish. Because I feel like when most people are in school, they just write and do aimless shit. Like they do aimless papers and they're just like, oh, I just need to pass. Like I just need a grade. And it's like when you're living it fully, like your life is fully submerged in this. And it's so cool to see and to watch your journey. Like, even if you just, scroll way back in your Instagram, you can see everything you've been through because yes, you document it, but yes, you're also so open about it. And it's like, it's constant and it's so awesome to just, obviously I'm not a part of it, but it feels like the viewers are because we can see everything and you are very transparent and you share the good, the bad, the ugly, everything.
Yeah, that's kind of my goal, right? Is like, I know that like there's a lot of and like, so far this journey has been like very good. It's been very like relatively low complicated, except for like crazy headaches and like like stuff like that. And I've kind of talked a little bit about that kind of stuff. But I have gone through a miscarriage as a surrogate, and I have talked pretty openly about that and what that was like. I've done kind of in-depth podcasts with what a birth is like for surrogacy, and I think it's just really good for people to see from a surrogate's perspective, because that's not one that's normally talked about, because surrogacy is pretty like hush hush. So a lot of times when you hear about surrogacy, it's from the point of view of someone that used a surrogate, and the surrogate is kind of anonymous, right? Like, all these celebrities and stuff that use surrogates. Well, no one ever talks to the surrogate.
Yeah, why? I wonder.
And I think it's like maybe it's too because like those are the stories that are like in the media and things like that, and maybe they're a little bit more private with that kind of stuff, because I think celebrities probably in general are a little bit more private about things like that. But I was like, you know what, like I have the platform, so if I have it, I might as well use it to help, and like I answer a lot of questions on my like inbox and things like that, and it just like people being like, I might need a surrogate, like can you just tell me a little bit about it and what and so kind of just helping to kind of guide people. And that's really what I want to do as my career. And that's what I'm hoping to do kind of when I graduate in April, is do more like actual fertility counseling. So people that are hey, like they can book sessions with me, they can book Zoom calls, they can book that to go over like here's where we are in our journey, here's where we live, and then
Mhm.
then I kind of am familiar with the Canadian law. I'm familiar with kind of how to go about it, what agencies there are, how they need to kind of the steps they need to take, the costs that are associated with that. So I kind of do want to turn that more like basic advice giving into no, I'm actually
Yeah.
qualified. I'm qualified to actually give advice about this now. So yeah, that's kind of my goal after I graduate is to be able to actually provide info sessions and things like that for people to kind of learn and understand and get a direction of where they want to go.
Well, and who could possibly be more qualified than someone who has lived through it multiple times?
Yeah.
Um, so, but that, I guess that kind of brings me back to advocate for this and to make the laws chain, like, I don't want to say easier, but to make it so it's a little more understandable. How and what are people supposed to like? Is there, you see these petitions going around, people sign, you got to get X amount of signatures, whatever. What is it that you do, or you could do, or would do, or theoretically to make it legal?
Yeah. So there are a lot of like lobbying efforts. Of course, everything with COVID right now has kind of stopped a lot of stuff,
Yeah,
right? Because a
pause.
lot of things are on the back burner right now as far as legislation goes. So a couple of years ago, I actually was part of like a lobbying effort in Ottawa where we went and talked to different like MPs and stuff like that, and kind of made the case for decriminalizing surrogacy. And there is some places that like are continuing to do that and stuff, and it's really just about getting like the awareness out there, advocating, writing letters to your MP. Like if you're someone that's using a surrogate or need a surrogate, or you are a surrogate, writing to your MPs being like, hey, like this needs to change. Like, there's a decent percentage of people in the world that need assisted reproduction. Why is it not covered by
Hmm.
healthcare? Why is it excluded from extended health care? And like why it should not cost us $80,000 to have a baby just because my uterus doesn't work or whatever it is. You know what I mean? Like I feel like infertility is one of those medical conditions that's just like excluded. Like if you need insulin, you can go get insulin. And if you need a heart transplant, you can get a heart transplant. And if you need like any other medical assistance, like that's there. But for some reason, infertility is like, oh, too bad. Like,
I wonder why though. Like people, there is a real thing about being sterile. There is a real thing about being, not being able to have kids, or only having miscarriages, or not being able to get pregnant. Like it's a real issue
yeah,
that family or women and men and whatever face. So why is it and it's everywhere. It's not like I know women who, they've done IVF, 6 times, 8 times, and it's like each round is super expensive. Even if you do IUI, it's still expensive.
yeah.
Like obviously much more affordable than IVF, but why doesn't it, no insurance covers it? It's not like why,
Yeah.
why?
Yeah, and well, I think it's really comes down to kind of it's just not mainstream and people don't talk about it. And I think people are starting to in
Because
those
people don't talk
conversations.
about it, that's why, I guess.
Yeah, and like people like, all these people in legislation tend to be men that don't deal with this kind of stuff. They're not dealing with recurrent miscarriages. They're not dealing with hormone issues. They're not dealing with low lining issues. Like those just aren't things that they're having to deal with. So
Mhm.
it's not even on the radar. So unless we put it on the radar, like
Right.
actively and aggressively constantly put it on the radar, it's not going to be there. And I think that's where like the advocacy piece comes in, right? And being able to be like, look, this is a real thing. Like this needs to change. Like this needs to be part of healthcare, because reproductive health is healthcare. So I think that's kind of an important thing to kind of just keep like nagging at them long enough. They've got to change the laws at some point.
Well, and I think that when you explain it, like if someone needs insulin, you get it. If someone needs, these other things, if you break your arm, you get a cast. Like it's an actual thing. It's a real issue. And I think that when you explain it that way, it's like, oh, because if, like, for example, like when people don't go through it, how are they supposed to know? And exactly what you said, most of these men, because the reality is when you're a woman, you're the one who's going through it. Like my husband doesn't know anything about what's going on with my body, or he's like, he's like, let's have sex. I'm like, babe, no, I'm fertile right now. Like, I don't want to get pregnant right now.
Don't touch me.
Like, no. And I was like, you know what? Let me put the app on your phone that I use to track it. He's like, I don't want. And I'm like, then don't be crazy when I say no, because I see what's going on and I know that this app knows what's happening. So no.
Yeah.
So I think that it's like, until they actually, and the reality is, I mean, it goes back to sex education and really, or infertility education, or, your whole life you're trying to prevent getting pregnant. And then one day you're like, oh, let's get pregnant. And it doesn't work that way. So it's like, it goes way, way, way further, or it should theoretically start much earlier and much sooner. Um,
I agree.
so I don't really know.
And
It's almost like, where do you start? Like, how it's just this cyclical of, well, when can you start teaching kids? Like, I mean, you have girls, and it's like, it's a whole thing, even being a stepmom, or, it's like, and the more that I interview women and I speak with women about this, it's like, there's just so many things that we face that men they don't even, it just,
yeah.
boop. So it's like, there are so many things, and I feel like the second that we speak up and say, like, hey, like, we need a little help or something like this, whether it's our husbands or the lawmakers or, whatever it is, I think that that's when, exactly what you're saying, when you're constantly picking and nagging and a little bit, eventually they'll get the picture.
Well, and I think women in general, like, are kind of always taught to kind of sweep things under the rug, and it's not as bad as it seems. And it's like, when you have issues that only affect women and stuff, it's like, well, yeah, like, but you have to kind of get your voice out there, right? And like, it's tough. Sex education is a big one that I really want to try to like do. And like, I would love to do talks at high schools. I would love to kind of like do speaking and stuff around that, because that's one thing that is completely lacking from the entire sex education curriculum. Like, completely. If you look at the sex education curriculum, there is nothing besides don't get pregnant.
Right.
It's not, what if you have PCOS? It's not, what if you have endometriosis? What if you like don't ovulate? What, like, and then there's, first of all, and then not to mention that there's basically zero information for like homosexual kids or trans kids, like nothing. And so it's like, it's like this very narrow grouping of people that sex education applies to. And then what happens is if you have, 50% of the class that doesn't apply to, they're not listening.
Well, and like, do you know when they started over there?
Sex ed?
Yeah.
Okay, so so there was like a few years ago, there was like a reform to the sex education, and they started teaching it in like kindergarten, and everybody freaked out because, okay, so hear me out here.
Okay.
So it was like health sex education, but in kindergarten it was talking about like consent, and it was talking about your body is your body, and it wasn't here's how to put a condom on a banana in kindergarten. It was consent, and it was, but everybody freaked out because sex education was starting in kindergarten. And
why would they name it that? I mean, the problem,
I think it's just, that was the other issue, right?
It's all like marketing, so they need to market it to that group so parents don't freak out.
But even like, I think like starting in grade 4, 5, and 6, you should be talking about those things.
Yeah.
You should be like, children should be able to anatomically name body parts. I know kids that are 10, 11, 12 that don't know proper names for things. And like the social worker in me, or the future social worker in me, always goes to like, when we see kids who are abused and stuff like that, like, this is why this is so important that they learn this stuff early on, because if they're learning in school that your body is your own and no one is allowed to touch it but you, unless you say so, unless it's the doctor, unless they're looking, like, you know what I mean? And then you have a kid being like, oh, well, that's not happening at home for me, right? Like, it kind of like, if we totally exclude that, then we're like missing opportunities to help kids, right? That's my whole other like.
No, but you're absolutely right. And this also is a whole nother thing that's not talked about.
Of course.
Like, and
there's a lot that's just not talked about. And I think as kids get older, and especially in high school and stuff like that, sex education should be extremely inclusive.
Totally.
You should be talking about why you still have to use condoms if you're in a same-sex relationship. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it should not just be about preventing pregnancy, because statistically, 1 in 6 of them probably aren't going to be able to get pregnant.
It's crazy.
And, so if you have that many kids in a classroom, like, you should be teaching, like, hey, like, and then this happens, and really explaining things to kids, I think would be important, especially in high school, right? When they're
Yes.
getting older and stuff like that, and they're understanding more. Like, talk about how low ovarian reserve affects your body, or how low lining would prevent you from getting pregnant. You would be amazed the number of surrogates I know that are still like, oh, but like, can I be a surrogate if my tubes are tied? Well, yeah, because you're not using your eggs and you don't need your tubes. That's the thing, right? There's really not a lot of education past don't get pregnant. Here's how to use a condom. Use birth control, and the whole consensus is about not getting pregnant.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Like,
And it's
it's about what if you can't get pregnant?
yeah, no, it's really so crazy to think that. And there a lot more light needs to be shed on it, because it's not ever. And I guess that only when you get there, right? So you have kids, you're doing surrogate. Like, I have a little one, so this is something I'm constantly thinking about now. Like, well, how are we gonna have the talk? And even though, she's just a few months old, it's something that I do think about, because I see, you look at other parents and you see, oh, I like that, or I don't like that. I don't want to do that. I do want to do that. So it makes you really think and question, and, well, what happens when we get there? So it's definitely something that needs a start.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Like, I I would definitely be an advocate for making sex education way more inclusive. Like,
Yeah.
I'm someone who believes that access to birth control, it should be very easy. It should be very easy to get access to birth
Yeah.
control for teenagers. It should be very easy for them to get access to a health center and things like that. And I think it's better in Canada than some parts of the States, for sure. But it's not perfect, right? And we can see in other countries that they're seeing positive rate. Like, when you teach sex education, when you teach proper forms of birth control, when you make it available,
Mhm.
abortion rates go down, teen pregnancy rates go down. Like, as a whole, they're more educated. Like, I just think there's a lot more we could be doing
Yeah.
in that department. As an aside from all the infertility stuff that I do, I think that's, like, actually something that's really important
Well,
too.
what do you think? I guess, because this would have to start with the parents, right? Like, the parents go to the schools and they say, listen, this is whether it's a public school, a private school, whatever. I'd assume that private schools would be able to make changes a little bit easier and more quickly. Um, what would you suggest? Because it is something that, I mean, obviously you can start at home and
Yeah,
talk about it freely and openly, but if one kid is missing out, or two kids don't understand, or they're not getting, because in New York, or where I am in the city, it's very nanny driven. It's very, the parents are working and the nanny's with the kid for 12 hours or 14 hours, and the nanny's not going to talk to the kid about that. The nanny barely speaks English, or, like,
yeah.
whatever it is. So it's a very interesting kind of disconnect of, it has to be at school. Like,
Yeah, I think that's, like, the hard part too, right? Because, like, as a public school, like, our kids are in public or Catholic. So
yeah,
that's the other thing. We have
yeah.
some kids in Catholic education, and they're like, they just skip over the whole thing. Like, sex education, who needs that? You know.
Yeah,
So
yeah, you
I
should,
think
yeah. God.
I think it's tough because, well, and Catholic schools even more, like, don't, like, they don't necessarily believe in IVF,
Mhm.
or don't support IVF necessarily, or assisted reproduction, or homosexual relationships, or trans relationship. Like, you know what I mean? So it's difficult to kind of make something inclusive when the system is designed to be non-inclusive.
Right. Yeah.
And I think, like, the hard part, right? So, I think, but again, like, the more people know as a whole, and, I'm one tiny, tiny, tiny little piece of this, but everybody who shares, and everybody who's open, and everybody who, is like, yeah, I'm going through infertility too. And then people know about it. Like, 10 years ago, nobody knew if anybody was going through infertility. Even still, like, you have no idea the people around you that have been struggling with miscarriages. And, you know, in the type of stuff that I do, I have a lot of people that message me being like, I just had my third miscarriage at 5 weeks. These are people I have known for years. And I had no clue. Or people, or family members or stuff like that. And it's just like, you would have no idea, like no clue. And like, I just think the more we like talk about it, not saying that everybody needs to talk about it. I don't think that, obviously people want to keep certain things private, and that's okay too. But I think the people that are comfortable, like, kind of bring those things to light, because no one knows it's happening. We know it's happening. We know 1 in 4 people have miscarriages, or 1 in 4 pregnancies end in miscarriage, but no one talks about it. And there's been a good handful of people that I'm close with, that I've known, that have come to me and be like, I need your opinion on this. Like, we've been trying, because they know that I'm kind of knowledgeable about that. And I'm like, I had no idea. Like, I'm so sorry. I had no idea that you were going through all of this. And these are people you work with, your neighbors, your people in your kids' soccer practice classes. You know what I mean? Like, these are normal, everyday people that are going through this, and it's way more common than you know. Way more common.
There was something that I heard of recently, and it made me really realize how undereducated we are as a population, as women, as, there's a lacking component and it's basically if you have a negative blood type. Do you know about this?
Yep, I have negative blood type, so.
So do you have to do that, or maybe you don't, the Rogram shot, or?
Yeah. So I haven't had it yet in this pregnancy. You usually get it right around I think at my next appointment I'll get it.
How does it work? Because how is it that, like, I'm a mom. I didn't even know my blood type until I had her, basically, because, you're in the hospital and they're telling you all this stuff. I think I might have even come across it in the paperwork. I don't think they ever told me, but it's like, how, like, that's, I think, is that a basic thing? Because clearly it's something that.
Blood types.
What's that?
Like, it's only if you have a negative blood type, and it's basically to prevent your body from fighting off the baby. So if the baby has a positive blood type, your body might try to fight it off. Now, typically in pregnancy, if you have early bleeding, you have to get it. So in my 2 pregnancies ago, I had early bleeding at like 6 and 7 weeks. I had like a subchronic hematoma, which is like almost like a blood pocket in the uterus. And when it comes out, it's very scary, because there's blood everywhere and you think it's miscarrying. Well, that happened at like 6 and 7 weeks. And so I had a lot of bleeding. So I had the Rogam shot quite early. This time I've had no bleeding, so it can wait until closer to the 3rd trimester. But it's basically to prevent your negative blood type from fighting off a potential positive blood type baby, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, but I mean, I only learned about it maybe a month ago from a woman who I was talking to on here also. And it's like, why?
There's a lot that, like, people just don't know.
Like, you would think that, like, and obviously when you become a mom, or, you're going through this, you learn a lot, like every day you learn something new. But it's like, there are certain things where maybe when kids are younger, oh, hey, you're, because how many times have you've given blood, you've had your blood drawn, you've done this, you've done that, and you never know your blood type. I never knew my blood type until I had my kid. So it's like, maybe they should tell you these things.
Yep. Yeah, I knew my blood type when I was in high school, because when I was in high school, once you turn 17, you can go donate blood, and you get out of class if you go donate blood. So me and my friends would be like, yeah, let's go donate blood. And then I found out I have a rare blood type. So then they're like calling me all the time being like, come and donate. We need your blood. So then I donated like a good couple times and all that kind of stuff. So I found out really early what my blood type was. So I knew I was negative. I'm AB negative. So,
yeah.
So they always call me. They're like, can you come donate? I was like, sorry, I'm pregnant again. I can't.
So when you're pregnant, you can't donate? or at
No,
certain
because your blood volume and stuff like that, like you don't want to be like giving so much blood
extreme.
like and stuff like that, so you can't do it while pregnant.
And then there was another question that you just made me think of, and I think you would know this. When you, not you, but generally speaking, when someone goes to essentially check their fertility level, is this a thing? I don't know if it's a thing, but basically they can tell you the age or the potency of your eggs.
I think what you're talking about is an AMH.
Tell me.
It's that an AMH is typically something they use to kind of do the level of like ovulation or like the quality of or how many embryos, how many eggs you would ovulate. So I found out that I actually have a very high AMH count. So I typically ovulate like 2 eggs like every single cycle, if not more. I found that out. So they're like, wow, you're really fertile. And I was like, well, good thing I only had one kid then, because that I guess that doesn't matter. But yeah, they were surprised. Like when I saw a fertility doctor, he's like, I'm surprised you haven't naturally had twins because you ovulate from both sides. Like all like you ovulate from both sides. So that's like, how you would get fraternal twins, right? So and I was like, yeah, I guess we're just lucky. But people that have and fertility testing, there's a lot that goes into it, right? It's like it would be great if you could just go in and get one test to be like, and this is why you can't get pregnant. But there's so much, because there's hormone levels, there's ovarian issues, there's lining issues, there's like an embryo issue, there could be sperm issues, there's motility issues, there's so many things, and it takes a long time sometimes to figure that out. And unfortunately, it's a lot of trial and error, and it costs money. You have to go to the fertility clinic. It costs money to get these tests done. And you have to go in. Sometimes you have to go in on like cycle day 1 or cycle day 2, okay, to do some of the testing. Well, if that comes back and they're like, oh, we don't know, well, then you got to wait till the next cycle so that they can do testing again. Or, you have to come back multiple times in a cycle to figure it out. You're taking time off work, you're doing testing. Sometimes you'll be taking, like, if they suspect ovarian issues, you'll be taking medications to help induce, facilitate ovulation. If it's a lining issue, you'll be taking extra medications to thicken a lining. If it's a miscarriage issue, maybe it's your hormone levels or progesterone. Like, it's just, there's trial and error all the time. And I know that that's really frustrating for people. I have family members that are dealing with that right now. And it's frustrating. It's the constant unknown. And then you get the dreaded, like, unexplained infertility. And it's like, you're a doctor. You should be able to explain this to me.
You would
And then,
think.
a lot of people going through like infertility, that it's just frustrating, and it's just like heartbreaking, because you're like, why? Like, why isn't this happening? And
Yeah.
I feel like I've learned a lot. Like, when I went into surrogacy, I was very like optimistic and very like, oh, surrogate, like, so great. And like, I was part of this like community of surrogates, and we were all awesome, and we went to the retreats, and like, it was great. And I'm like, this is so cool. And now it's like, I'm like, okay, that was great, but like, there is a whole side of this that is like not sunshine and rainbows here. And I felt very left out of that side initially. And it wasn't until I really started like really getting into everything and really learning on my own and really trying to understand, that I was like, this is hard for these people. Like, I remember when I transferred, so like the baby I'm pregnant with now, his older brother, when I was in the process of getting pregnant with him, I remember going for embryo transfer and being all excited. And I had like my fancy socks on and like my like, like good luck t-shirt and all this stuff. But I remember my intended mom being sad. And like, I felt so terrible, because she was like, oh, like, today is the day I realized that I'm never going to be able to carry my own baby. And my heart like shattered, because I'm like, oh my God, here I am thinking that I'm like this like superhero who's coming to like save her day. Because this is like, 5 years ago, when I like really didn't understand what all went into this. And I just felt so bad, because I'm like, I didn't even think about it that way.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't think about that. And I feel terrible for not understanding that. And I think kind of since then, I'm like, I try to be really sensitive to intended parents and sensitive to kind of the journey that they're going through. And be a lot more like empathetic, because this is hard. And I recently did a post actually about like infertility trauma, because that's something that as a counselor that comes up, right?
Mhm.
And it's that, the trauma of infertility doesn't go away when you have a baby. When you finally get that baby, those feelings don't go away necessarily. Like, I talk to intended moms, they're like, I have a baby now, but every time I see a pregnant person, I want to cry.
Yee.
Like, and I'm like, yeah, like that's heavy stuff, that this is trauma. And I think people really underestimate what goes into this. And I think initially I was so caught up in the surrogacy is so great and this is so awesome and stuff. And I'm like, man, like I'm a very small piece to their puzzle here. Like,
Yeah, but you're giving them a gift that no one else could give them.
yeah, and my intended mom will be like, "Are you kidding? You're like the best thing. You're like the only reason we have our baby is because of you." And I'm like, "I know, but like what I have done is like nothing compared to the journey you've been through and the journey that all these other intended parents have been through and everything that they continue to go through." And I just feel like I got so much more empathy for these families and stuff, and just I don't know, it just felt different going into it a second and third time, because it was less about being part of this surrogacy sisterhood, and like it was more like these people deserve to have children, and like it is awful that like it's so difficult, and like I want to do whatever I can to help. And I think I had a big like kind of, I don't know, reframe for it,
Yeah.
on what it meant to me and what surrogacy meant and why I do it. It's not like, it's not to I want to just help all these people and do all this. It's like it's so much deeper than that. You know what I mean? It's almost like I don't even know how to explain it. Like, it's just like,
Yes.
I've never been through infertility. I've never had to deal with that, but I've been close to a lot of people who have. I've counseled people who have. I've had a lot of discussions with people who have, and become close to them. And I just think like I want to do my best to really understand and be sensitive to that during this process too. And part of surrogacy is realizing that like this is hard for them. This is not an easy road. Even though you're happy your surrogate's pregnant, like it still brings up a lot of feelings, I'm sure, about being able to not do it yourself, right? That's hard. That's hard to do. And as a woman, when you're told your whole life, like that your whole goal in life is to have children and be a mom and all this stuff, and then you can't, that's a lot of like negative feelings. And like my job as a future counselor is to work with people for that and helping to process this trauma, because infertility and dealing with miscarriages and dealing with recurrent loss and the trauma and the financial struggles and the constant like comparing to other people, like this is trauma. And I think there needs to be more specialized counselors that are familiar with this process. And I'm very familiar because I've been through it, and through kind of my training and my experience and talking to women and counseling women during this, like, I think there needs to be more people that are really specialized in this type of specific trauma that comes along with infertility.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like everything that we talk about, it's just such, I don't want to say basic stuff, but it is. Like half the population, or more than half the population is women. A huge part of those women, the huge percentage, have babies. And even more than that percentage probably want to have babies. So it's like it's something, and it just goes back to kind of normalizing it and talking about it and, openly discussing, because
Yeah.
the more that we just keep sweeping it under the rug, the more it's just going to be overlooked.
Yeah. Yeah.
When it comes to like counseling women and this type of stuff about that specifically, is it because there's a woman who I think that her also, that or I don't know if you do. Anyhow, she's done IVF, IUI, she's had twins, she just had another one. But her thing was actually the exact opposite of what you're saying. Is so she got pregnant with twins with an IUI, and then she had to have a reduction, or with triplets. She had to have a reduction.
You're talking
You know
about
what I'm talking
Erin.
about. Yeah. And I love her. And it's crazy because, you don't think about it. And she said to this day, like her and her husband barely spoke about it. And only recently did she actually like confront it head on. And, that's when you really kind of work through things with anything in life, but this especially because everywhere you go, you see pregnant women and kids and schools and so it's like something that how can you really just keep it bottled up? You really have to deal with it because
Yeah, yeah. And I think like I've talked to a couple people on Instagram because my messages are always full. I like keep having to go back and like be like, okay, I need to respond to these 100 messages before the next ones come in, you know. So I try to respond to like all of them, but I do have intended parents and stuff that will like message me and stuff like that. Be like, it's really difficult, or how do you process this, and how do you do that? And I think the problem is that like I've had intended parents tell me that like they've gone to, or moms who are trying to get pregnant, go to counselors, and counselors like just not understanding about infertility. I was like, man, this is not like, okay, there needs to be specialized fertility counselors, and they are out there, but there's not a lot of them. And especially ones that are really knowledgeable about all the different things that go into it. If I have a client that comes in and tells me about, all the medications they're taking, I'm going to know what that means. I'm going to know the acronyms that they're using. I'm going to know what, BFP means, and I'm going to know what DPT means, and like all these little infertility acronyms, which is almost like a whole language in itself. I'm going to understand that, and I'm going to be able to kind of identify with that a little bit. So I think that helps, even on a very, very surface level, just being educated about infertility and the treatments, the medication, the process, because that saves someone having to come in and explain to you for 3 sessions that cost $130 an hour where they're at. I could do an overview and know exactly, like, I'm going to understand all of that because I know that stuff. I've had people tell me that they've gone to see counselors, and they're really struggling with the fact that they made it like, okay, so perfect example, and this is like something that comes with like loss and things too, right? So there was someone that messaged me, and they had made embryos, and they went to thaw the embryos, and none of them survived the thaw. So like their 3 embryos or whatever it was that they had were gone. And she was heartbroken, and she went to go see a counselor, and the counselor was like, okay, so they were just embryos. Like they weren't like, you didn't miscarry. Like it wasn't, and they didn't understand. And I'm like, okay, but to this person in
that's
like,
their
because
opportunity.
Well, how to grieve, right? We can't tell people how to grieve. We can't tell people what is a loss and what isn't a loss. Same like the person who went on my Instagram and said that my first journey doesn't count as a journey because the baby died. Okay. Well, that's great that you don't count that, but my intended mom sure did.
Yeah.
And the of needles that I took, and the DNC that I had to have, and the hemorrhage that happened after, and the heartbreak that happened, and the idea that that was their last embryo and they were never trying again and they were now done, that kind of counts actually in my mind. So
it's so weird. Like I just can't wrap my head around the people who just don't, like, they're just, maybe they're just not open-minded. Maybe, I don't know. People go through different things. People grieve differently. People, and so it's like, why can't you just be understanding of that? Like, why do you have to put your 2 cents in and say, oh, well, that doesn't count? Well, okay, maybe it doesn't to you, but who cares what you think? Because it's not happening to you. Why do you have to, say stupid things that just, like, I just don't get it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And as a future counselor, if I have a client, it is not my job to tell my client what they should and should not grieve. It is not my job to tell them that, oh, well, you don't need to grieve an embryo. It was just an embryo. Or you don't need to grieve a chemical pregnancy because it was just a chemical. It didn't really count. Well, if it counted to them, it counts. Like,
yeah, it's that simple.
That's important to kind of like it is not my job as a counselor or future counselor to tell you what you can and cannot grieve, and we're going to process it, and we're going to work through that, and we're going to talk about it, and we're going to kind of work our way through it. But some people, like, that those embryos were everything to them, and to hear that they didn't survive, that could be as devastating as somebody who miscarried at 12 weeks.
Yeah.
And you don't have the right to tell somebody what is and isn't grief for them, So, and I think that's like a lot of counselors just not understanding infertility. And I've had a couple people message me saying that the counselor that they have seen just doesn't understand that the chemical pregnancy meant something to them. Like, oh, so you weren't really pregnant. Like, Don't say that to somebody who's trying to get pregnant. Like, what are you thinking? Like,
Yeah, it's crazy.
it doesn't make sense to me. But honestly, it's infertility is a specialized area, and
Yeah.
that's kind of where I found my little niche and where I want to be, because I think it's important for people to really understand that, like, this is specialized stuff. You need to know a lot about this. Not only do I have all my training and my schooling in counseling and how to run sessions and different types of theories, and I work with like a cognitive behavioral therapy base or an interpersonal therapy base, and things like that, dialectic behavioral therapy and things like that. So, but infertility is completely different. You have to be knowledgeable about it. You need to know what you're talking about. You need to know what your clients are talking about
Hmm.
when you're discussing infertility, and recognizing that not every infertility journey is the same too. So like, whereas someone maybe like, maybe they're not grieving the chemical pregnancy, but they are grieving the fact that, they can't buy a house now because they're trying to pay for embryo storage. Like those are all things too, right? It's complicated, it's compound, and it needs more than just, I think, a regular counselor. And that's really why I want to specialize in fertility specific counseling.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and it's something, I mean, it goes back to we generally are so undereducated. Like, I know nothing about this, which is why I've been like, okay, ready, ready, ready. Because it's so interesting. And I think the more that I have been speaking about this openly, the more women have come to me and said, "Hey, could you help me? Could you direct me? Because now that obviously I don't know anything, but I know more than the woman who's going through it, because she doesn't even know how to ask for help or who to talk to, or so it's a very interesting thing doing this podcast and like really speaking with people in depth and going through their experiences and understanding, because it's like it's one more kind of, I guess, outlet or resource for people that I know, or people to reach out to me and say, hey, could you direct me to so and so, could you have an introduction, and I'm like, yeah, I'm more than happy to. And I think this is like, our slow steps. It's a slow process. It's us doing our little bit of help, our little bit of good, to just share.
That's exactly the way I see it, right? It's just like, if I can do anything that will help even one person figure out where they're doing this, or counsel one person, or send someone in the right direction, like, I think I'm doing the right thing, and being able to kind of advocate with a platform, and being able to kind of, do podcasts and do lobbying in Ottawa, and with Parliament and stuff like that. And like, I think it's all those little steps that help, like, oh, this is real. This happens for a lot of people. And reassures intended parents that, like, hey, there are great surrogates out here. Surrogacy is a viable option. You don't have to be afraid of it because you don't know about it, because I'm here to tell you about it.
Mhm.
Or people that want to be surrogates. I am very, like, very clear about on my Instagram, when people are messaging me, it's like, there are very clear guidelines to be a surrogate for a reason. They're there for a reason. They should be followed. Even if not every fertility clinic follows them, the basic, like, the big rules and stuff like that kind of govern surrogacy should stand. Like, for instance, it's like, the general guidelines is that a surrogate should have no more than 5 previous births
Mhm.
and no more than 3 previous C-sections. So, are there wonderful women that have had 9 children and have great births and everything's great and they want to be a surrogate? Sure. Should they? Probably not. Of course, there are clinics that do kind of make exceptions for stuff like that. I've seen exceptions made for higher BMIs, for a lot of kids, for more C-sections. It's more lenient in Canada, which I don't necessarily think is probably the best thing. I think this is another thing. I feel like I'm like stacked against me a little bit being a Canadian surrogate, because a lot of American surrogates don't like Canadian surrogates.
Why?
Because so we can't be paid, so a lot of
Oh, so people go that you can do it cross borders essentially, or not really?
You can. What I mean by that is that I think a lot of American surrogates get the idea that Canadian surrogates feel like we're better than them because we're doing it for free, which is not the case. I think you're a good person and you're doing a good thing, whether you're getting paid 40,000 or whether you're being reimbursed 20,000. I don't really see a difference there, right? But as well, like, you know, there are less restrictions. Some of the clinics in Canada will allow a lot more things that US clinics won't allow, and will sometimes maybe go against those general guidelines. And so I think a lot of like American surrogates get very like defensive of that, being like, no, like the guidelines are in place for a reason because they're there to minimize risk to you and the baby and the intended parents and all that kind of stuff, right? So yeah, so but I think like I really want to be like, no, 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 like just because they'll allow you to have 9 births doesn't mean that you should. And if someone came into my inbox and is like, I've had 8 children and I really want to be a surrogate, I would be like, no, like you shouldn't.
Yeah.
Even though maybe if they went to an agency or a clinic here, maybe they'd be like, sure, okay. I would say I don't think that's in your best interest. Same with being done having your own kids.
Right.
That's like one that is it's technically not a requirement for surrogacy. It's a really strong recommendation. One that I think is really important because secondary infertility is a thing. And IVF has increased risk for the placenta, increased risk for bleeding, increased risk for complications and things like that. And I personally know of surrogates who have lost their uterus being a surrogate due to bleeding and due to, you know, have had to have emergency hysterectomies. I know surrogates who have had ectopic pregnancies and had to have their tubes removed or their ovary removed or something happened. So it's very, very important to be done with your family. Whereas there are some clinics or some agencies or intended parents that are like, oh, well, yeah, if you want to have your own kids after, that's fine. You know, but if a surrogate came into my inbox and was like, hey, like, I really want to have a few more kids. I was thinking of doing a surrogacy first because I want a bigger age gap between my kids. And then in like 4 years, having another baby. I would advise them to wait.
Right.
You know, because, and then I'll explain the risks and explain why this is important. And, you know, because I think that's something that maybe isn't done as much, being like, this is why this rule is important. And this is why you should follow it. Just because somebody is willing to bend the rules or somebody is willing to kind of go around this doesn't mean it's probably the best option for you. And I think my goal is to kind of inform and be like, this is the information you need to know. If you choose to go against that, then there's nothing really I can do, obviously. But that's the recommendation. This is why it's in place. This is why it's important. There are risks by not following this, you know, that kind of stuff, right? So I think the American guidelines are much better. And those are the ones that I kind of say, like, if people come to me, they're like, these are the general guidelines. This is what you should be following. You know, I just think there needs to be a little bit more regulation. And I think a lot of people in the surrogacy community, it's a small community, and people get very defensive of it, as they should, right? Like, I think this is something that's important to a lot of people, and keeping it legal and keeping it safe and keeping it regulated is really, really important. It's really important to me. And I like cringe every time I see those like horrible stories in the media about, you know, the surrogate that kept the baby or like all this stuff. And people are like, oh, this is why surrogacy is so bad. I was like, no, this is why illegal, unregulated surrogacy without a contract is bad.
Right.
You know, like there's reasons that there's rules in place, and you need lawyers and you need contracts, you need pre-birth orders. Well, not in every single state it does that way, but like, you know, there needs to be proper things in place here. You can't just, it's just not as simple as maybe some people think it is, right?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, you touch on so many things, and I think that you have like a little dictionary, like the acronym dictionary, you touch on, I feel like, nearly every little aspect in your Instagram. So you have it in your stories, you've definitely posted about all the things. I think it's a great resource for people. You said you were making a binder you did for your class of, you'll be using that obviously because it's fully functional and up to date and all this good stuff. Yeah, no, it's a crazy thing because you only hear about bad stories, which doesn't make sense. Like, I mean, I guess, you know, the news, if you want to hear the latest killing or murder or anything bad, turn on the news. Like, you never hear anything good on the news. So
Yeah, I think that's the other thing too is like, obviously these crazy surrogacy stories that went haywire and like, obviously that makes news because it's news and it's exciting and it's like,
Yeah.
oh my God. But then I think it like discounts the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of successful surrogacies that all happened at the same time that nothing's being reported on. You know what I mean? And I think it's been really good, like, because like I've done a lot of podcasts, I've done interviews with CBC and like with the radio stations here and stuff like that. And I think it's just really good to show the positive side of this too, because it's not, surrogacy shouldn't just be the news button when it goes wrong.
Mm-hmm.
It should be something that's normalized and kind of that the positives are seen too, and that these are viable options to grow your family, and that normal regular people do this every day, and they're doing it every day, and it's that's just part of life. And surrogacy shouldn't just be in the news when some crazy surrogate with that didn't have a contract took the baby.
Right. Well, and that's,
Like,
I guess, what we're,
this works.
I mean, and that's, I guess, the more that you're talking about it, we're slowly, step by step getting there.
I think so. Yeah.
I was going to ask about, there I am, scatterbrained. Shocker. With when you basically, so one, I think that it goes back to you having experienced this. You're going through it. You already have your family. So and you can make a recommendation according to you've lived through it. Where people that set these guidelines, who knows who wrote these guidelines or, made these laws. And it could be these men, again, who don't know and they haven't been through it and they haven't had a baby. So they don't know how it works or, that these things do create to have a hysterectomy or to be sterile or any of these things. But the other thing I was going to ask you is, when you use your social media, how
Mhm.
do you, I mean, I think that you're very patient because you see the good in people. So you think, oh, well, they just don't know. Where I'm like, get off my page, asshole.
Yeah.
Block sometimes. But how do you like just deal with it? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
cordially responding, but it's like, getting so many comments, messages, crazy people. And it's like, yes, we talked about this briefly, but one, you're putting yourself out there to be attacked. So we know that going into it. But at the same time, surrogacy, it's not just this lewd, disgusting thing. There's a procedure, there's steps, and,
Yep.
there's,
Yeah. Well, that's so. So okay. So two parts to that. So this is why I think like really being open is so important. So I recorded my embryo transfer, and if anybody goes to look on my feed and scrolls down in the bottom, I actually recorded the embryo transfer. I took my camera. I asked permission, of course. Took my camera into the transfer room, like the operating room, and like filmed the screen. You can see they put a speculum in. They put a catheter in. They're like, okay, this embryo, this case, Ariel Taylor. They double check all the dates and they insert it. And I showed the ultrasound screen of them physically putting the embryo, and it looks like a little shooting star when it goes in, and you can see it. It's a little light in my uterus, and I recorded it, and I was like, well, you all just watched me get pregnant. So if that isn't, I don't know what is. But like these are the things, right? And so many people were like, I had no idea that's how IVF works. And I feel like that old like TV where it's like, now like that's like that's what I think. I'm like, how does no one know? Like, but I think, but it's because no one shares that kind of stuff. And, I think it's good to show that. So people are like, oh, that's what IVF's like. People ask me all the time, does it hurt? And I was like, well, no, I took you in there. It was about 30 seconds long. And, it was super exciting, and this is what the room looks like, and this is how it works. And I think it's good to show that kind of stuff. So that's part of like being open, is I'm very open with stuff like that. And like I think I can kind of like show that perspective without having, because for someone who's going through it for themselves, I think there's a lot of like trauma that goes like we talked about, right? And a lot of feelings that brings up. But for me as a surrogate, for me, it's a pure educational base, right? I don't have an attachment necessarily or any negative feelings towards all this stuff, right? It's just, for me, it's like pure educational based, right? So it's kind of like a different perspective. And then, so what we were saying about like dealing with people, I kind of, no, I would say 95% of everything that I get, messages, comments, and stuff like that, is positive. I would say, like, if people don't like surrogacy, they don't follow me.
Yeah, simple.
Every once in a while I'll get like some random like person make some comment, but it's like usually some like fake account with two posts and 0 followers. So I'm like, well, I'm not overly concerned about your opinion. You know, I think the way I try to approach it is always from an educational base. And I always think, even if this person is just kind of being like a jerk or something like that, and they're really just trying to stir the pot, like, it's not my job to change their mind. It's my job to show, and it's okay if they disagree. I'm not asking everybody to agree with surrogacy. I'm not asking everybody to think it's right, because some people just purely don't. And you know what? You're entitled to your opinion. But I also think, like, I'm a professional and I want to be a counselor, and I don't want anybody to ever look at my feed and my responses and be like, wow, she was really rude.
Yeah.
Like I always try really hard to educate and be, open and responsive, and, hey, you don't have to agree with surrogacy. It's totally fine. We don't have to say rude things, because, and the other thing too is always think, and I've said this to somebody on a comment before, someone being like, oh my God, surrogacy is so disgusting, blah, blah, blah. Or like, the person that said that my journey wasn't a real journey because the baby died. And I'm like, gosh, how would that intended mom feel to read that?
Yeah.
That, oh, my baby didn't count because it died. And I always think, like, you have no idea. I always urge people to, you have no idea what family members can see you write, what your peers, what your employers or employees or coworkers and things like that. And chances are at least one of them is dealing with this. And how hurt would they be if they read some comment that you wrote about how, oh my gosh, well, maybe if God didn't want you to have a baby, like, or maybe if God wanted you to have a baby, he would have given you one. Like, how hurtful is that to, what, that's your opinion. And if that's it, I'm not going to sit here and try to change your mind. Yeah. But keep in mind that there are people you care about that are probably going through this. And I just think it's important to kind of like come at this, at least from my perspective, with a little bit of grace and a little bit of compassion and a little bit of empathy, and just kind of, I educate the best I can. If there's really, really silly comments, I just delete them. Because I'm like, no, there's certain things that just aren't going to be on here. But that's part of being able to have the platform, right? Like, I am in control of what's on here.
Totally.
And I just think I want it to be a positive space, and I want it to be a place where people can feel comfortable following and sharing and becoming educated without having people like attack them. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, so last 2 questions. One is about education, and then the other one is, and I know you've addressed this, but quickly, people say, well, why don't you just adopt? And you have a very good response to this, because you do.
Yes. I just did a post recently about this, about why intent parents like always get the question, well, why don't you just adopt? Every time a surrogate, why didn't they just adopt? There's so many babies in the world that need homes. Okay, first of all, there actually is not. And I can speak for Canadian kind of foster care, et cetera, that there's a big focus on not removing kids from homes. And they've really tried to not, because they've seen the long-term effects of just removing kids from homes. CAS, which is your version of like CPS, is that what it's called?
Yeah, the protective, yeah.
Or the CAS. And I think it's like there's a big focus on now parenting and going in and helping families and building resources and connecting them with their communities. And in rare cases where a child is in danger and needs to be removed from the home or put in foster care, typically they like to put them with kinship matches first. So family members, friends, people that they know, keeping them in their communities, that's first priority. And then foster care is kind of secondary. But the goal of foster care in most cases is to have a supplementary home while they can work with the parents, parenting skills, workshops. In some cases, they're going to treatment centers or jail or, things like that. That happens too. But the goal is always to keep families together. And so even if you have a child in foster care, they likely are not up for adoption unless both parents die and there's no kinship match and there's no grandparents and no aunts and uncles, and like there's really not as many children up for adoption as people think they're up for adoption, just because there's a lot of kids in foster care. So not to mention that like the foster care system isn't, you can foster to adopt, that definitely is a thing. And the problem is though is that a lot of people want to adopt babies. There's
Right.
not a lot of babies to adopt. And the other thing too is it's not guaranteed. You're not guaranteed to get a baby. I personally know somebody who went through the adoption process, took their baby home, named the baby, like, and then the birth mom changed her mind like 28 days later, because they have up to 30 days to change their mind.
Wow.
So, surrogacy, not only in most cases, it's their biological child.
Mm-hmm.
They just need someone else to carry it. And it's a guarantee. I have no rights to that baby, even though I carried it. Canada recognizes surrogacy. Most states recognize surrogacy in that ways. I am not the mother. I don't go on the birth certificate, nothing like that, right? So it's a guarantee. And the other thing is adoption's expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Very expensive. And in some cases, it can be just as expensive as surrogacy. And for a lot of people that have already gone through infertility, they've probably already had a lot of those costs associated with their fertility clinic. They probably already made embryos, which is a big cost, right? So in order to kind of get the surrogate, it's not really that much more than being like, okay, now we're going to switch gears and try to adopt.
Yeah.
There are people that try to adopt for years and it doesn't work. And then they turn to surrogacy because it didn't work. And a second part to that is my like biggest thing is like, it is not the infertility community's job to adopt all the unwanted babies in the world.
It's true.
And like, it boggles my mind.
You're right.
You go on like Facebook things where there's all these like, keyboard warriors being like, oh my gosh, why didn't they just adopt? And then you like click on their profile and it's someone who has like 7 kids. And you're like, well, I'm assuming you adopted all of those, didn't you? Why do you have any more of a right to have biological children than somebody else just because they need a doctor to help them?
Yeah.
Or a surrogate to help them, or medication to help them? You know what I mean? So I recently did a whole post about this, and like it got shared so many times because people were like, yes, like no one is
Yes.
for all the babies. Do I think adoption is wonderful? Absolutely. Do I think that it works so well for some people? Absolutely. And I think it's incredible, but it's not for everybody. And it shouldn't be the go-to option just because you can't have kids.
Yes. I love that I can ask you pretty much anything and you have a very, very solid answer. And then the other question that I had is about education with, and this isn't even a question. It's more of just adding on to it because there aren't so many studies, there aren't so many statistics when it comes to, and I'm assuming exactly what you're saying with the pregnancies and this, but like being pregnant and just no, but obviously I get that no one wants to be a test rat or whatever the heck they're called when you're pregnant, but there are studies need to be had and taken. And like, I'm very curious about, health and wellness and like fitness during pregnancy and this type of stuff. So, and obviously nutrition and all this, but obviously very few women are interested in participating in that. And it's exactly what you were saying before about you having to really dig deep and just, kind of scrounge for any sort of numbers or anything because, we've been having babies for thousands and thousands of years, yet there's very few statistics or studies or research or anything done. And it's like, I don't understand why.
Yeah. Well, it's tough too because pregnancy, it's like the ethical concerns of studies done while pregnant, especially if there are risk involved. Like that's like the big thing is the ethical thing. Something that like I would be really interested in seeing, and I think that a lot of people are really interested in seeing is outcomes of surrogacy and donor conceived children. So I did a big project last year actually about donor conceived children. I took a family therapy course, and so I kind of direct everything into some sort of fertility. So I'm good at writing about it. So if I can write 15 pages and a research study about this, I'm like all over it. So and the problem is that like so much of the research, some of the most recent research we have about egg donor conceived children is like from 2006. And those were, yeah, like that was some of the most recent. And the problem is that when all those children were conceived, because these were all now adult children or teenage children or people old enough, they had really bad outcomes. And I'm like, what is happening? Well, then what I realized is when you're going through the research and you're looking, the reason that they had so many bad outcomes is because these kids were never told that they were donor children until they were adults. And they found out at 18 or 19 or 20, or sometimes even longer, that they were from an egg donor. And so when you separate the studies of kids that knew they were from donors and then ones that didn't, the ones that knew they were from donors had much higher outcomes. So it's focus studies, and I have yet to really find many studies at all about surrogacy children. And and the few that we do, again, it's like kids finding out that they weren't, like that they were born via surrogacy, but like years and years and years later. I think when you normalize it, it becomes normal, right? And like if it's, like the kids that I've given birth to know that I gave birth to them, and it's just like, yeah, like mommy couldn't grow you in her uterus, or in the case of my last surrogate baby, he has two dads. Well, neither of us have a uterus, so we couldn't grow you, and it's, when you normalize it, it becomes normal. You know what I mean? So I think a lot of the negative outcomes come from the secrecy and the taboo of it, and kind of like the shame that comes along with that. But if you take that all away, then there's far less negative outcomes. You know what I mean?
Well, and it's like, it's not that complex. Like my uterus, I couldn't carry you. Like it doesn't, and when you say it so simply, it's like, why is that so difficult for people to say? Or
yeah. Adults put so much emotion behind it, right? And put so many meanings behind everything and like all this stuff. If you tell a kid, like my daughter, when she was like 2.5 or 3 when I was pregnant with my last surrogate baby, which had two dads. And I have a video of her also on my Instagram if anyone wants to like scroll down and look at it. But she's holding up the test, and I was like, Scarlett, like what does that mean? And she goes, there's a baby in your belly. And I was like, whose? She's like, Mark and Kevin's, because they're dads and they can't grow it, so you can do it. Spot on, girlfriend.
Like that's right.
It's just, it really is that simple. But I think adults put on so much like emotion behind it and so much meaning behind everything. And like, it really just is simply like, they can't carry it on their own. They just need an extra person to kind of help bring their baby here. Yeah. And so it's just going to grow in my body for 9 months, and then you get your baby back.
Yeah, I think that when it's that simple, it's just that simple.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to keep talking because so we're going to have to do a part 3, even though this is only part 1, even though it's technically part 2. That's confusing for people, but whatever. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, of course.
I enjoyed this so much. And I hope you are over your migraines and you keep feeling well. And I'm going to be following you. Do you have anything else you want to share? I'll definitely include your handle here so people can, go check out your Instagram page, because there are so many interesting things and all sorts of everything's there, basically having to do with this. Anything else you want to share?
Right now, I'm just using Instagram. I share everything to Facebook as well, under the same handle. So just Carried with Love or carried.with.love. But everything from Instagram kind of just gets transcribed over to Facebook. So Instagram's the place to kind of see everything.
Amazing. Amazing. Cool. Well, have a good weekend. And I'll talk to you soon. Hopefully I'll see what's going on your page.
Good. Yeah.
Amazing.